Firm Foundations, Creation to Christ. Welcome back to our study. We are now in lesson 19. And before we get into this current study, we're going to look at just a couple of review questions from a previous study. First of all, how are Esau and his brother Jacob different? Remember, Esau and Jacob, they were sons of Isaac, and Isaac was the son of Abraham, and these two would be Abraham's grandsons. How are these two brothers different from each other? Because remember, they were twins. They were born on the same day. And basically, it's Esau, the older one, the one that was born first, lived for the present, lived for material gain. He did not value God's promises concerning this coming one, this blessing for all nations, the deliverer. Remember, God first gave that promise to Abraham, then he gave it to Isaac, and he was going to give it to Isaac's firstborn. But Esau, he didn't value that promise. He rejected his inheritance. And Jacob, he trusted God and valued his promises concerning the blessing for all nations, the deliverer, this coming one. Jacob valued that from God. He believed God. And if you read the whole story of Jacob, you're going to find out Jacob was not a perfect man by far. But when it came to the things of God, he believed God and he sought after the things of God. And so God chose Jacob to receive the inheritance from his father, which was not the normal human way of doing things, because Esau, the firstborn, rejected God. So even though things didn't go according to how men see things, how do we see in that why God hadn't forgotten his promises concerning this deliverer? Just because things weren't perfectly normal, the firstborn, the way that men passed down their inheritance, God still didn't forget his promises because he is unchanging. He always does what he says, and he will use all kinds of circumstances to fulfill his plan. And his plan, by the way, is for our benefit. God has our best in mind. But he does things his way. And so when Jacob was fleeing his family because Esau was mad at him, he had a dream on the way. What did Jacob see in the dream that God gave him? He saw a ladder resting on earth with its top reaching to heaven. God's angels were walking up and down the ladder, and God stood above it. That was his dream. And so that takes us to, what was the meaning of this dream? Well, the ladder was symbolic of God connecting earth to heaven. Through this promised one, someone's coming to people, so people could have a restored relationship with God, an opening between the presence of God and earth. People, that restoration of that relationship, that was the whole reason for these promises, and this promise of this one that would be the blessing to all nations of the earth, blessing to all families of the earth, this coming one. That's what that was meaning. And God gave the promise to Abraham and the promise to Isaac. He also gave to Jacob. Although God spoke to Jacob through a dream, how does he usually communicate with man today? I mean, could God still use dreams? Yep, he could. But in these dreams that we find in the Bible that God gave to individuals, he was communicating something. He was communicating something important for our well-being. But God today, he usually uses his word, his written word, things that he communicated through history, and the people that experienced those things, they wrote down what they experienced from God and what they heard from God. And it's for us, it's in the Bible. And in the Bible, we already have everything we need for that restored relationship. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, they didn't have that thing already. It wasn't already possessed. God's promise at that point had not been fulfilled. So they were looking forward to the fulfillment of that promise, and we look back. And we have everything we need. Because this deliverer, this promised one, this blessing for all nations has already come, and he's for us. Also, in the Bible, we have everything we need for daily life. The Bible talks about every single human experience, every single relationship we could possibly have. The Bible has something to say about that. It's complete. We don't have to rely on dreams to communicate how we can be restored with God. Now, God can God use dreams? Obviously, He can. And does He in parts of the world where His Word is not present in a written form? Um, yes, He could do that. But for the most part, He communicates to us in what He had people write down. So now we get into this lesson. God promoted Joseph. God took Jacob's family into Egypt. And we're going to get into the life of Joseph to show how his family got into Egypt. And even though this deliverer, this promised one, was not going to be a direct descendant of Joseph, God used Joseph to protect the family through whom this deliverer, this promised one, would come, to protect Jacob or Israel, as his name was changed to. And we have we have that nation still alive today, Israel. Uh, so these people are going to be the ones who that God used to develop this nation, and God's going to save this nation, save these people. And so we get into this lesson, and we're going to see in this lesson that things happen in life that are difficult, and they're going to be difficult for this man Joseph, and difficult things come into our life, and there's unexpected twists and turns, but we need to remember God remains the same. His actions in the midst of human chaos and upheaval reveal he has a dependable character. Even though things go bad around us, God's still working out His plan. And it is for our good, which is pretty awesome. It's not just He does what He wants. He does what He wants, and it's for our benefit. And He uses all these circumstances, and He can because He's all-powerful, and He's perfect, and He's sovereign. He's in absolute control of all the details, and no one can stop His plan. So we get to this Joseph in Genesis chapter 37, and I'm going to read 2 and 3. Genesis 37:2. These are the records of the generations of Jacob. Joseph, when 17 years of age, was pasturing the flock with his brothers while he was still a youth, along with the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives. And Joseph brought back a bad report to them to their father. So Joseph's going back to the father. He's telling on his brothers. His brothers are doing dumb stuff. They're not doing their job. They're doing something wrong here, and he brings this report back to them. And 37:3. Now Israel loved Joseph more than all his sons, because he was the son of his old age, and he made him a varicolored tunic, clothes that are just really fancy. A tunic is what they wore in those days. But this Joseph was born when Jacob was an old man already, and Jacob or Israel loved Joseph more than his other brothers. First of all, I'm going to go ahead and say that's a bad idea, but he did. Don't choose a favorite son or daughter. Love them all the same, because we're going to see that this individual love, this favoritism, is going to cause problems. Jacob had 12 sons. Joseph was his favorite. So we get into our chronological timeline, and this lesson is going to be focused on one of the sons of Israel. And those 12 that are on the list, those are the fathers of all the families of the people that are now called Israelites or Jews. If you're not born as a descendant of one of these 12, you're not, at least not by blood, you're not a Jew, you're not Hebrew, you're not an Israelite. By birth anyway. So this Joseph, he believed God, and God is going to do some incredible things through him. And 37:4, it says, talking about Joseph's brother, his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all of his brothers, and so they hated him and could not speak to him on friendly terms. So that's the relationship between Joseph and his other brothers. They just hated him. He was a favorite son of their father. I imagine that some of them wanted that same attention, but for whatever reasons, they didn't get it. And Joseph, he was born when Jacob was old, and that was kind of a thing that set up him being a favorite. And there's various reasons. First of all, he's the favorite. Of why his brothers hated him, and his father had treated him specially. He gave him, remember we mentioned that vari-colored tunic, a special coat that stood out among all of his brothers, something extra special. And they probably could have hated him also because they failed to do right, and Joseph told their father about it. So there's a terrible relationship going on here. And then we get into Genesis 37, 5 to 11. I'm going to go ahead and read that. And Joseph dreamed a dream and told it to his brothers. And they hated him still more, as though they could have hated him enough. It was even more after Joseph told his brothers his dream. And Joseph said to them, I pray you, hear this dream which I have dreamed. For behold, we were binding sheaves in the middle of the field, and lo, my sheaf arose and also stood upright. And behold, your sheaves stood around and bowed down to my sheaf. And his brothers said to him, they understood the meaning of this dream. They said that, shall you indeed reign over us? I mean, he's the youngest brother. He's a kid. Shall you indeed reign over us? Or shall you indeed have the rule over us? Reign and rule. And they hated him still more for his dreams and his words. And he dreamed still another dream. And he told it to his brothers. So just Joseph, maybe he's getting a little cocky here. So he's a young kid. But he's telling his brothers his dream. And it continues on in verse 37:9. And he said, behold, I have dreamed another dream. And behold, the sun and the moon and the 11 stars bowed down to me. Because he had 11 other brothers. And the sun and the moon. And he told it to his father and to his brothers. And his father rebuked him and said to him, what is this dream you have dreamed? Shall I and your mother and your brothers indeed come to bow down ourselves to the earth before you? I mean, really, come on, you're just a kid. And in verse 11, and his brothers were jealous of him. But his father observed the saying. His father was kind of like, not sure about this. This is very odd. But his brothers, they couldn't stand him. Because first of all, he's a favorite son. And then he's telling them they're going to bow down to him. Are you serious? And you can imagine how we would react under those circumstances. And so we can continue on with Joseph. He's sold into slavery. In Genesis 37, 12 to 35, I'm going to go ahead and read just a few verses out of that passage, but what's happening here is Joseph goes back out to check on his brothers one day. His father sends him out to find out how his brothers are doing, take care of the sheep. And they see him coming, and remember the kind of relationship they already had with him. They couldn't stand him. And in 37:20, it says, now therefore come now, let us kill him and throw him into some pit. And we will say, some evil beast has devoured him, and we shall see what will become of his dreams. So they make this plan. That's how much they hated their brother. They get rid of them. And 37:24, and they took him and threw him into a pit. The pit was empty with no water in it. So they decided not to kill him, at least up to this point. They just threw him in the pit alive. And then while they're doing all this big caravan of travelers comes by. And in 37:27, it says, come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites. These guys are passing by on their way to Egypt and with all their trade goods. And they said, let us sell him to these people, and let not our hand be upon him, for he's our brother and our flesh. And this was one of the brothers trying to convince the rest of them. And it says that the rest of his brothers listened to this one brother who was trying to convince him not to actually kill him, sell him into slavery. And 37:28, and men, Midianite traders, came by, and they drew up Joseph and took him out of the pit and sold Joseph to the Ishmaelites, and for 20 pieces of silver. And they brought Joseph into Egypt. So his brothers first made a plan to kill him, and then they decided to just sell him into slavery, and they didn't want to spill his blood, actually, which is, I suppose that was kind of nice of them. But they took him and they sold him into slavery. And he was taken down to Egypt. So they're in Canaan, um, doing their family stuff, watching the business, and one day these traders come by, not from there, they're going somewhere else, and they get Joseph sold into slavery, and they take him down to Egypt. What a miserable experience. Joseph could have thought, hey, but I thought God was giving me those dreams and I was going to be a ruler. Now I'm a slave. What's going on here? God, what are you doing? Because Joseph did believe God, but you imagine that he didn't understand the circumstances. Um, so he gets down to Egypt, and he's sold to this governor in Egypt. He's not the king, but he's an important person in Egypt. His name is Potiphar, and he's um, sold into slavery to work in this man's house, probably more like a bit of a palace or some important place, and he's working there, and he does really well. God blesses him, and God raises him up to the kind of like the ruler of this man's house, and he has access to everything except for the man's wife. And the man's wife tempts him to lay down with her and have sex with her. And Joseph says, no, I won't do that. I have freedom in this whole house. The only thing that I'm not supposed to have anything to do with is you, because you're my master's wife. And then the lady accuses him of having abused her and attacked her. And the husband gets home, and he's thrown into prison. Again, what happened to God's dreams? Imagine what Joseph could have been thinking. And then in Genesis 39:20-23, it says, so Joseph's master took him and put him into jail, the place where the king's prisoners were confined, and he was there in jail. But the Lord was with Joseph. So even though circumstances are terrible, God was still with him. And we need to remember that. Even though our circumstances are very difficult, God is still with us because he's promised to be. And he has our good in mind. But the Lord was with Joseph in 39:21 and extended kindness to him and gave him favor in the sight of the chief jailer. The chief jailer committed to Joseph's charge all the prisoners who were in the jail, so that whatever was done there, he was responsible for it. Okay, God lifted him up, even in the jail. He's like the little second in command, the boss of the jail. The chief jailer did not supervise anything under Joseph's charge, because the Lord was with him. And whatever he did, the Lord made to prosper. God was with him. He even took care of him, protected him while he was in prison. God did not fail him. He was with him, even in that maybe one of the worst possible places we could have imagined. And God was still going to fulfill this dream that he'd given to Joseph previously. But imagine some of the circumstances that Joseph could have been controlled by if he didn't choose to believe God. So God's plans are still not ruined, even though he was in prison. God took care of him. In Isaiah, I'm going to read this a verse from Isaiah 46:10. It's not on the screen, but it talks about our God in the midst of our circumstances. 46:10 of Isaiah, it says, declaring the end from the beginning and from ancient times things which have not been done. This is a declaration about God, saying, my purpose will be established, and I will accomplish all my good pleasure. And even though circumstances seem to make things impossible, God will do what he has planned to do. And so Joseph's in prison, and God's taking care of him still, but he's still in prison. And then Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, he has these dreams. In Genesis 41, 1-8. And the dream is there's 7 fat cows come out of the river. And they're they're the kind of cows you look at and your mouth waters because you imagine the steak's going to come off of them. Just healthy 7 cows coming out of the river. And right after that, 7 scrawny, dried up, ugly, you could count their bones kind of cows come out of the river, and they eat up the fat ones. And this dream bothered the king, bothered Pharaoh. And then he had another dream. He had a dream of 7 plump ears of corn, just juicy and just big and healthy, and 7 of them. And right after that, 7 scrawny, dried up ears spring up, and they devour the 7 healthy ears of corn. Imagine how scary that could be, having these kind of dreams so vivid and so real. And this really bothered Pharaoh. But God was working out his plan, and God had decided to use this Pharaoh. This Pharaoh was an idol worshiper. He didn't believe God. He wouldn't acknowledge the true creator as the creator. He worshiped things of the creation. He worshiped things that God had actually created. But even though people who worship idols don't serve God, God can still choose to use them. And that's what he was doing with this king, with this Pharaoh. Using somebody, even though he's not a believer. God can do that because he's the ruler and the owner, ruler over and the owner of all people. And he can do that. He has a right to use anyone he wants, however he chooses to do it. He's sovereign and he's all powerful. In Daniel 4:35, it says, "All the inhabitants of the earth are counted as nothing, and he does according to his will among the host of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth. None can stay his hand or say to him, 'What have you done?'" A declaration about God again. A ruler over every single person, even if they don't believe him. He can use anyone he wants, however he wants to accomplish what he's planned. And he's done that, and he still does that. He is our life giver, our sustainer, and we rightfully belong to him, every single person, even if they don't believe him. And God can use us however he wants. So Joseph had these dreams, and Joseph interpreted them. And I already briefly just explained the interpretation. 7 healthy things, cows and corn in these dreams, and 7 wretched, dried up, skinny things. 7 cows and again 7 ears of corn, and they devour the healthy ones. And then he has these dreams, and he hears about this Joseph guy who's able to interpret dreams. And in 41:14 of Genesis, 14 through 16, I'll go ahead and read. It says, "Then Pharaoh sent and called for Joseph, and they hurriedly brought him out of the dungeon. And when he had shaved himself and changed his clothes, he came to Pharaoh. Pharaoh said to Joseph, 'I've had a dream, but no one can interpret it. And I have heard it said about you that you can interpret dreams, that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it.' And 41:16, then Joseph answered Pharaoh, saying, 'It is not in me. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer.'" So Joseph recognized that he didn't have the power of it in of himself. He couldn't do this. But he knew that God could. And he said, God's gonna tell you what these mean, what this dream means. And let's go on. Joseph trusted God, and even though this Pharaoh didn't, God gave him the dream of what he was going to do in Egypt, in this land, and in these people. Oops, let me go forward here. So Joseph goes ahead and tells him the dreams. It's going to be 7 years, 7 years of plenty, and 7 years of famine. A description of the future of the next 14 years. 7 years of plenty, 7 years of famine, and people are going to suffer. And so Joseph explains all this, and then Pharaoh responds in 41:38. And then Pharaoh said to his servant, Can we find a man like this in whom is a divine spirit? So even Pharaoh recognized something awesome is happening in this Joseph. So Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Since God has informed you of all this, there's no one so discerning and wise as you are. Joseph believed God, and God used him, gave him wisdom and insight. At 41:40, you shall be over my house. This is what the king's saying. According to your command, all my people shall do homage. Only in the throne I will be greater than you. Pharaoh said to Joseph, see, I have set you over the land of Egypt. So Joseph, coming out of prison, being a prisoner, goes right to the second in command of all the nation. You see how God's in control? God's giving dreams, and he's given the meaning of the dreams, and God is working out his plan. That's exactly what he did in the life of Joseph. Only God was able to do that. Only God knew of the future. He's the only one that could make something like that happen. In Genesis 42, 1 through 20. So they get through these 7 years. I'm just going to summarize this for the sake of time. They get through these 7 years of plenty, and Joseph is commanding the people, and they're storing up food. I mean, they're storing up masses of food. And then they get through the 7 years of plenty, and then they get into the 7 years of famine, 7 years of lack of food and suffering of the people. But because Joseph is stored up, God gave him the wisdom to do that. Egypt has plenty of food. They have plenty of food, and then this famine is also happening up in Israel. And Jacob and his sons, in other words, Joseph's brothers, they're suffering. They're running out of food, and Jacob sends 10 of his sons down to Egypt. By this time, Joseph had another younger son named Benjamin, and Jacob kept Benjamin at home and sent his other 10 sons. So they go down to Egypt, and guess who they have to deal with? Of course, they have to deal with Joseph. He's the ruler of Egypt, and nothing gets done without his say-so. And so they go down to Egypt, and they have to present themselves before Joseph, the king of Egypt, or the second in command. And they don't recognize their brother, but Joseph recognized all of his brothers. And so he hides his identity from them and doesn't let them know who he really is. And so he kind of treats them as spies because his brothers treated him so poorly. And they gave him a story of how he had 12 brothers and one was dead. They didn't realize the one dead one was the one they were actually talking to. And they have this younger brother. He's still at home. And Joseph says to them, I don't believe you. I'm going to take one of your brothers here and keep him in prison. And you're going to go home. And I want you to bring that younger brother back with you to see if your story is true. So, his brothers go back with him, and Joseph gives them food to take back to his family, and they go back to Jacob, their father, and they tell him all that happened. And this king says, we can't go back to him for any more food unless we take our brother Benjamin with us. And so I imagine they probably waited for a while, and they used up all the food they got, and they're maybe on the brink of starvation again, and so they have to go back to Egypt. And they go ahead and take Benjamin this time. So all of Joseph's 11 brothers come back to Egypt and present themselves again before Joseph. And this time, Joseph reveals his identity to them. And he receives his brothers with open arms and expresses his love for his brother and for his father. And they go back again, and they tell Jacob that his son Joseph is alive. And I'm getting a little bit behind on PowerPoints here, but just kind of summarizing all this history. And so Jacob's family, Jacob hears that Joseph is alive, and Joseph told them, come all you guys back down to Egypt. There's plenty of food here, plenty of land, and you'll be taken care of. God's given me the wisdom to save up all this food and save all these people. So his family goes back down to Egypt, and Jacob took all his family with him. In Genesis chapter 45. We're at 45. And I'm going to continue on because I'm briefly summarizing all these verses that we have on the screen here. In 46, I'll read 26 to 27, where it says, all the persons belonging to Jacob who came to Egypt, his direct descendants, not including the wives of Jacob's sons, were 66 persons in all. And Joseph and the sons of Joseph who were born to him in Egypt were 2. And all the persons of Jacob's house, the house of Jacob who came to Egypt, were 77. So we have all these people coming down to Egypt, 77 with Jacob, all of his sons, down to Egypt, and they were going to be able to survive and live through this famine because Joseph had the wisdom to save up all this food. And Joseph could have been vengeful toward his brothers. He could have been, but he wasn't. And then we read in Genesis 50, verse 20, it says, Joseph talking to his brothers, he says, as for you, you meant evil against me. Well, that was really true, wasn't it? These brothers meant evil against Joseph, but God meant it for good. Joseph's focus was on his creator God. He had faith in him. He believed him. He says, but God meant it for good to bring it about that many people would be kept alive as they are today. Joseph recognized that all his life difficulties were working out for good because God was fulfilling his plan. And so Jacob and all of his family, Israel, went down to Egypt. And remember what let's go back in history just a little bit. In God's communication to Abraham, who would have been Joseph's great grandfather, in Genesis 15:13, it says, and God said to Abraham, know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs. They will be enslaved and oppressed for 400 years. So Jacob is now, in his family, fulfilling what God had communicated to Abram, that they were going to be down there. When they went there, they didn't know how long they were going to be there, but they were going to be there for 400 years. And they were going to be oppressed, and we'll get into that in our future lessons. Oppressed by the Egyptians, and they were going to be there for 400 years, fulfilled. This promise of this history of Jacob going down into Egypt. And God did that through the life of Joseph to save his family. So even though this Joseph is not the direct ancestor of the promised deliverer, God's working out his plan to bring this promised one to earth, to be a blessing to all families of the earth. And God uses all kinds of crazy circumstances in our life to bring about good for us. And the bottom line is God has a future of blessing for us, even though we have to experience difficulty in this corrupt planet we live on. And the fact is, we do go through different difficult circumstances. But God is working out his plan, just like he was doing in the life of Joseph. And there was all kinds of details that went into Jacob's family being saved from the famine. It was Joseph's dreams. It was his father's love for him, making him this special coat. And it was even in the midst of Joseph's brothers hating him. All these details contributed to the outcome. Joseph going out to check on his brothers and even bringing a bad report, and these Ishmaelite traders going by and buying Joseph as a slave and taking him into Egypt. And this Pharaoh having dreams, and God giving Joseph the ability to interpret dreams. And Joseph being responsible for all the stockpile during the 2 sets of 7 years, during his 14 years, the years of plenty and the years of famine. And the famine that spread even all the way up to Israel. And Joseph and Jacob having to go out and look for food down to Egypt. All those details played into God's plan. And God used them all. And you know what? God has not changed. He is the same God today as he was for the life of Joseph. God's still at work in so many details of life, and we can rest in that. He's sovereign. He'll do as he said. He will complete his word. He's the creator. He has the final say in all things, and nothing and no one escapes his attention. And we're going to leave our lesson there. God's at work. He's sovereign. He will work out circumstances in our life. He has our best interest in mind. Um, so until next time, we'll finish this lesson for now, and we'll continue in our next lesson, in lesson 20.